Alpha Bravo, Charlie, Delta Echo Foxtrot, Golf Hotel India, Juliett, Kilo Lima, Mike November, Oscar Papa Quebec, Romeo Sierra Tango, Uniform Victor Whiskey X-Ray Yankee Zulu. If you've ever served in the armed forces or worked in the aviation industry, these words are most likely permanently seared into your brain. And even if you haven't, you've probably heard them used in countless war movies and other places. This is the NATO Phonetic spelling alphabet, a series of 26 words mapped acrophonically onto the letters of the Roman alphabet. Officially adopted by NATO in 1956, this alphabet has since become the de facto standard for militaries and civilian organizations around the world. But what is this alphabet even for, and how was this collection of seemingly random words chosen? Well, Lima, Echo, Tango, Sierra, Foxtrot, India, November, Delta, Oscar, Uniform, Tango, as we dive into the long and fascinating history of phonetic spelling alphabets. Radiotelephonic or phonetic spelling alphabets, not to be confused with phonetic alphabets, which indicate how words meant to be pronounced, were developed in response to the limitations of early voice communications technologies like telephones and radio. Due to static, distortion, and the tendency of these devices to cut off certain frequencies or the start of words, many sounds can become indistinguishable to the listener. For example, notes C, D, E, V, P, and Z in the American style are often mistaken for one another, as are M and N, F and S, H and 8, and 5 and 9. The lack of visual cues when speaking over the telephone or radio only adds to the potential confusion. When transmitting vital information such as military orders or instructions between aircraft and air traffic control, even minor misunderstandings can have serious consequences, so pending significant improvements in telecommunications technology, some sort of interim solution was needed. Early on, radio and telephone operators hit upon the method of assigning a distinct code word to each letter of the alphabet, such that the receiver could recognize the letter being transmitted, even if parts of the code word were distorted or cut off. Even with recent advances in transmission quality, this practice persists to this day, with people often coming up with their own phonetic spelling alphabets on the fly. After all, who among us, while dealing with customer service over a particularly unreliable telephone connection, hasn't resorted in frustration to spelling out names or addresses by shouting D as in David, A as in Angel, V as in Valentine? One of the first formalized phonetic alphabets was developed in 1898 by the British Army's Royal Corps of Signals. This was a partial alphabet with code words assigned only to those letters most likely to be confused. AC for A, B for beer, Emma for M, Pip for P, S is for S, TOC for T, and Vic for V. The remaining letters remained unchanged, though regulations dictated standard pronunciations like a rolling R and a long O. This early system had a significant impact on British culture, spawning enduring British slang terms like AC for anti-aircraft fire, Emma G for machine gun corps, Pip Emma for prime minister, and TOC H for Talbot House, a veterans organisation and Christian movement founded after the First World War. Interestingly, many of the earliest spelling alphabets were intended not for communication with voice, but rather Morse code, though the basic principle remained the same. Like spoken messages, Morse transmissions could become garbled due to electronic interference or poor signaling technique. Thus, when sending important information, it was preferable to send entire code words instead of individual letters, so that at least part of each word would be recognized and the accompanying letters more easily worked out. The longer the words, the greater the chances of them being understood, leading to some truly unwieldy alphabets, like this one used in Tasmania in 1908. Authority bills capture, destroy, Englishman, fractures, galloping, high, invariably, juggling, knights loose, managing, never, owners play, queen remark, support the unless vindictive, when expeditiously, your zigzag. While this may seem like a truly odd and random collection of words, they were designed to be arranged in a particular order as memorization aid for the telegraphers. Englishmen invariably support high authority unless vindictive. The managing owners never destroy bills. Remarks when loose play jangling, fractures, galloping, zigzag knights expeditely capture your queen. Another telecommunications alphabet in use at this time was the Against Barbarian system, developed during the US Civil War and consisting of the words Against Barbarian, Continental, Dahlia, Egg, Furiously, Gallantly, Humility, Ivy, Jurisdiction, Kangaroo, Legislator, Mountain, Noble, Offensive, Photographer, Queen Catherine, Rebecca, Several, T, Uniform, Very Varied, Waterloo, Exhibition, Youthful, and Fair, Too Long, Too Short. Unlike the authority bill system, however, these words were not intended to be transmitted. Rather, the syllables in each word were meant to help telegraphers remember the Morse code sequence for each letter. For example, against, with one short and one long syllable, corresponds to Morse code letter A, dot dash. Similarly, barbarian corresponds to B, or dash dot dot dot. continental, or C, to dash dot dash dot, and so on. But while certainly clever, the system was far from perfect. Not only could its creators not be bothered to come up with an actual word for Z, instead opting for the lazily literal too long, too short, but the ambiguity of which letters belong in which syllable could potentially lead to confusion. For example, spelling out continental as con-tin-en-tal rather than continental would yield dash dash dot dash, that is Q rather than the intended C. Still, Authority Bills remains a fascinating if flawed attempt at demystifying Morse code for new telegraphers. Coming back to radiotelegraphic spelling alphabets, the partial Acq-Beer system was still the royal core of Signal Standard Alphabet when Britain entered the First World War in 1914. By war's end in 1918, however, it had been replaced by a complete 26-letter alphabet which introduced several words that persisted all the way to the present day. Apple, brother, Charlie, Dover, Eastern father, George, Harry, India, Jack, King, London, mother, November, October, Peter, Queen, Robert, Sugar, Thomas, Uncle Victoria, Wednesday, Xmas, Yellow Zebra. But while Apple, brother, also known as Signalese, became the standard system for the British Army and Royal Flying Corps, the Royal Navy, always a bit of a contrarian, adopted its own unique alphabet, retaining several elements of the old Acq-Beer system. Acq-Beer, Charlie, Don, Edward, Freddie, George, Harry, Inc., Johnny, King, London, Monkey, Nuts, Orange, Pip, Queen, Robert, Sugar, Toc, Uncle Vic, William, X-Ray, Yorker, Zebra. The system also had a lasting impact on British culture, with F for Freddy and S for Sugar in particular remaining part of many Britain's informal phonetic alphabets to this day. F for Freddy was also the name of several aircraft during the Second World War, including a Vickers-Wellington bomber featured in the 1941 British documentary film Target for Tonight, and a Mosquito bomber flown by the Royal Canadian Air Force. The latter is significant for having survived 213 operations over enemy territory, more than any other Allied bomber of the war. However, in a tragic irony, F for Freddy's luck ran out on May the 9th, 1945, just one day after the end of the war in Europe, when she crashed into the control tower at Calgary Municipal Airport in Alberta, Canada, killing her pilots, flying officer John Baker and Lieutenant Maurice Briggs. After the war, elements of the Army's Apple Brother and Navy's Acq-Beer systems were combined to create the Royal Air Force radiotelephony or Apple-Beer spelling alphabet, which comprised the words Apple Beer, Charlie, Don, Edward, Freddie, George, Harry, Inc., Johnny, King, London, Monkey, Nuts, Orange, Pip, Queen, Robert, Sugar, Toc, Uncle Vic, William, X-Ray, Yorker, Zebra. In 1921, Apple Beer was adopted as standard by all three branches of the British Armed Forces as well as the civilian aviation industry, and would remain so until well into the Second World War. Meanwhile, the American Expeditionary Force, which joined the First World War in 1917, had its own standard phonetic spelling alphabet, comprising the words Able, By, Cast, Dock, Easy, Fox, George, Have, Item, Jig, King, Love, Mike, Nap, Opal, Pup, Quack, Rush, Sail, Tape, Unit, Vice, Watch, X-Ray, Yoke, Z. Many of these words would remain in the various iterations of the US military phonetic alphabet until the adoption of the NATO standard in the 1950s. Up until this point, most phonetic spelling alphabets have been developed for military use. The first internationally recognized standard alphabet for civilian use was introduced in 1927 by the International Telecommunications Union, or ITU, and used the names of cities from around the world: Amsterdam, Baltimore, Casablanca, Denmark, Edison, Florida, Gallipoli, Havana, Italia, Jerusalem, Kilogram, Liverpool, Madagascar, New York, Oslo, Paris, Quebec, Roma, Santiago, Tripoli, Uppsala, Valencia, Washington, Xanthippe, Yokohama, Zurich. Over the following decade, this alphabet was officially adopted by dozens of organizations around the world, including the International Commission for Air Navigation, the International Radio Consultative Committee, the International Maritime Organization, the Civil Aeronautics Board, the International Amateur Radio Union, and the American Radio Relay League. Finally, in 1941, the United States military developed one of the most famous and widely used phonetic alphabets until the adoption of the NATO standard. Officially called the Joint Army-Navy Radiotelephony Alphabet, this system comprised the words Abel-Baker, Charlie, Dog, Easy, Fox, George, How, Item, Jig, King, Love, Mike, Nan, Oboe, Peter, Queen, Roger, Sugar, Tar, Uncle, Victor, William, X-Ray, Yoke, Zebra. Officially adopted by the Air Force in 1943, the Abel-Baker alphabet soon became standard across all the Allied nations and was used in all sorts of applications. For example, fans of the 2001 HBO miniseries Band of Brothers will recognize Abel-Baker, Charlie, Dog, and Easy as the names of infantry companies of the American 506th Infantry Regiment. The Army-Navy alphabet was used to name several American nuclear tests throughout the 1940s and 50s, such as Shots Abel and Baker of Operation Crossroads in 1946 and Shots George and Item of Operation Greenhouse, while the first animals successfully recovered from outer space by the US in 1959 were a pair of monkeys named Miss Abel and Miss Baker. Meanwhile, on the other side of the conflict, the Germans had their own phonetic alphabet developed during the 1920s, and composed of a bunch of stuff that I'm probably going to pronounce incorrectly, so I'm just showing it on the screen now. However, after the Nazi Party came to power, all Jewish-sounding names were replaced with more Aryan-sounding ones. Specifically, David was replaced with Dora, Jacob with Julius or Jot, Nathan with Nordpol, Samuel with Siegfried, and Zacharias with Zeppelin. And you thought the Nazis' fanatical obsession with anti-Semitism couldn't get any more silly. Though the American Abel-Baker alphabet remained in use after the Second World War, it soon became clear that it had many shortcomings. Indeed, during the war itself, one Major F.D. Handy of the US Army Air Force Directorate of Communications partnered with Harvard University's Psychoacoustic Laboratory to scientifically evaluate the effectiveness of the Army-Navy phonetic alphabet under actual combat conditions. These experiments revealed that few of the Abel-Baker code words were actually all that intelligible, and in his final report, Major Handy included a list of 250 possible replacement words. Despite this, after the war, the Abel-Baker alphabet was officially approved and adopted by the United States government for use in civil aviation. In 1947, the International Telecommunications Union, or ITU, criticized the Abel-Baker alphabet for being too Anglo-centric and containing many sounds unfamiliar to speakers of other languages. For example, certain Spanish pronunciations of the letter P might sound more like a B to an English speaker. In response, the organization created its own alphabet, whose words were chosen to be accessible to speakers of English, French, and Spanish. This included a unique numbering system in which the names of numbers in both English and various Romance languages were combined, and I'm going to show them on screen again because it's a pronunciation nightmare. The following year, the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, began developing its own universal phonetic alphabet. This effort was spearheaded by Jean-Paul Vinet, a professor of linguistics at the University of Montreal, who laid out 5 major guidelines for word selection. 1. A word must be live, that is, still currently in use in English, French, and Spanish. 2. It must be easily pronounced and recognizable by speakers of all 3 languages. 3. It must have good transmission and readability characteristics. 4. It must have similar spelling in English, French, and Spanish, and the initial letter must be that which the word identifies. 5. It must be free of objectionable connotations or double meanings. In 1949, ICAO presented its finalized alphabet, which comprised the words Alpha, Beta, Coco, Delta, Echo, Foxtrot, Golf, Hotel, India, Juliet, Kilo, Lima, Metro, Nectar, Oscar, Polka, Quebec, Romeo, Sierra, Tango, Union, Victor, Whiskey, Extra, Yankee, Zulu. The timing of this announcement couldn't have been better, for the formation of NATO that same year increased the urgency of finding a new phonetic alphabet usable by all member nations. But while the 1949 ICAO alphabet was very close to the current NATO standard, it still had some issues. For example, several of the words, such as Delta and Extra, Nectar and Victor, and Kilo and Metro, sounded very similar to one another, while Extra broke one of Jean-Paul Vinet's selection rules by not starting with the letter it was meant to represent. Nonetheless, the alphabet was officially adopted by the ICAO and the International Air Transport Association, or AITA, in November 1951 and entered civil aviation use in April 1952. Still, believing that the alphabet needed further refinement, in late 1942, the ICAO conducted an extensive series of tests using speakers from 31 nations to find superior replacements for the most troublesome code words. As a result of these tests, Beta was replaced with Bravo, Coco with Charlie, Metro with Mike, Polka with Papa, Union with Uniform, and Extra with X-Ray. This new ICAO alphabet was evaluated by NATO in 1955, with a final report concluding that it is known that the spelling alphabet has been prepared only after the most exhaustive tests on a scientific basis by several nations. One of the firmest conclusions reached was that it was not practical to make an isolated change to clear confusion between one pair of letters. To change one word involves consideration of the whole alphabet to ensure that the change proposed to clear one confusion does not itself introduce others. Consequently, the alphabet was officially adopted by NATO on March 1, 1956, and internationally for civil aviation use soon after. Aside from one change, the replacement of Nectar with November in 1961, the alphabet has remained unchanged to this day. In its current form, the NATO phonetic alphabet features many small details intended to maximize comprehension for all users. For example, Alpha is intentionally spelled with an F instead of a PH, as the latter is not pronounced as an F in all languages. Similarly, Juliet is intentionally spelled with 2 T's, since in French the single T at the end of the word is usually silent. The selection of some words requires a measure of compromise and nuance. For example, while football was found to be more comprehensible in isolation, Foxtrot was ultimately selected as superior for long-term communication. There are also specific regulations for how numbers must be pronounced. For example, 3 is pronounced tree, 4 as foer, 5 as five to prevent confusion with fire, and 9 as niner to prevent confusion with 5 or the German word for no. Furthermore, numbers under 1,000 are spelled out digit by digit, for example 57 instead of 57, or 160 instead of 160. The only exceptions are 10, 11, and 12 for indicating clock positions, as in 12 o'clock high. While the NATO phonetic alphabet is meant to be universal, minor regional changes are often necessary. For example, in Malaysia, London is used in place of Lima, as the latter means fire in the Malay language. And at Atlanta International Airport, Dixie is used in place of Delta because the airport is home to Delta Airlines. Finally, certain languages use additional code words to indicate letters not found in the English language. For example, German uses Alpha Echo, Oscar Echo, Uniform Echo, and Sierra Sierra to indicate umlauted A's, O's, and U's, and the eset, while Spanish uses ñoño to indicate an N with a tilde. And that is the story of the NATO phonetic alphabet, which, like many of its predecessors, has had a significant cultural impact far beyond the military sphere. For example, during the Cold War, Checkpoint Charlie became one of the most infamous diplomatic hotspots in Berlin, while today expressions like Zulu time for Greenwich Mean Time and Bravo Zulu for well done and Whiskey Tango Foxtrot for, well, you know what, have become pop culture staples. But perhaps the most famous expression derived from the NATO phonetic alphabet originated during the Vietnam War in the 1960s. North Vietnamese guerrilla troops operating in the south were known as the Viet Cong, or VC. This was later then translated via the NATO phonetic alphabet to Victor Charlie, or Charlie for short.